Dear audience, welcome to Simania, Salon Readings, a platform I coordinate as part of the activities organized by the Association of Latin American Jewish Studies, known as LAJSA, which I warmly invite you to join. I am Cynthia Gabbay, a researcher and writer currently working at Humboldt University in Berlin, and my research is funded by the German Research Foundation. Today we gather for the presentation of Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas, Hispanic Moroccan Jews and their Globalizing Community, a book written by Aviad Moreno. Simania, which means bookmark in Hebrew, was created to provide a space for discussing books related to Latin American Jewish studies, whether new releases or long-standing works of interest to the field. I would like to renew this invitation, whether you are an author or a curious reader, if you believe it is important, for example, to discuss the poetry of Venezuelan Elias David Curiel or the narrative works of Brazilian Samuel Rawet. LAJSA provides a space for engaging in meaningful dialogue about this and other works of shared interest. Simania's meetings encourage the multilingual debate that is characteristic of Jewish cultures, where the official languages of LAJSA are Spanish, Portuguese, and English. We are open to incorporating other languages into Simania. Let's make this space a warm place, not only for debate, but also for the exchange of enthusiasm. I will take the chance to announce our next meeting that will take place next month on January 20, year 2025, and we will present the book Los Rabinos de Malvinas, la Comunidad Judía Argentina, la Guerra del Atlántico Sur y el Antisemitismo by Hernán Dobry. With that said, I will now introduce today's participants. Aviad Moreno is a senior lecturer at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He also heads the Communities and Mobilities Hub at the Azrieli Center for Israeli Studies. He's the author of more than 40 articles and several books, including Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas from this year to 2024, Europe from Morocco, the Minutes of the Junta of Tangier from 2015, and he's also co-editor of the Long History of Mizrahim, New Directions in the Study of Jews from Islamic Countries in 2021. Moreno serves on the Content Committee of the ANU Museum of the Jewish People, Israel's National Academy for Ladino, and is an académico correspondiente of the Spanish Royal Academy. Adriana Brodsky, who is with us also today, is professor of Latin American and Jewish history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Her book, Sephardi Jewish Argentine, Creating Community and National Identity, appeared in 2016, and her most recent publication is a co-edited volume called Jews Across the Americas with Laura Leibman. She has published on Sephardi food, schools, beauty contests, and Latin American Jewish history in general. She's currently finished a manuscript on Argentine youth in Zionist movements between the 40s and the 70s of the 20th century. And of course, she's co-president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, our LAJSA. Regarding our presentation today of the book Empowered Diasporas, Hispanic Moroccan Jews and their Globalizing Community, the book focuses on the cultural particularities and history of North Moroccan Jews in the Hispanic world, the broad diaspora, and in Israel. The book innovates on the theory on Moroccan Jewish diaspora and brings interesting histories on the comings and goings of Moroccan migration, taking into account its cultural aspects, especially relating to its language, Haketia, and other cultural phenomena. Let's now please hear first of all, Adriana and our guest, our author, who will discuss in the form of a dialogue about this book. Please, Adriana, it's your turn.
Well, thank you. It's actually a pleasure to be here in Simania thinking through and discussing Aviad's book. So as Cynthia said, I'm just going to start with a very brief description of the book and what I found interesting and rich, and then we will move on to a series of questions that will allow Aviad to expand on some of the topics that he deals with in his book. So, Entwined Homelands, Empowered Diasporas is a sophisticated analysis of the history of a community that felt and feels strongly connected to their country of birth, Morocco, to the medieval Spain that expelled their ancestors, to the modern Spain that later welcomed them back as colonial subjects, then as children of the diaspora, and finally as eligible citizens. They feel connected also to those who left Morocco during the eras of global migrations and later decolonization to settle in other parts of the world, mainly in this book, Venezuela and Israel. In these pages, Hispanic Moroccan Jews emerge not as merely enduring the momentous political and social changes and events that affected them, their country of birth, and the region, but as actively shaping their futures by choosing paths that would make them resilient and stronger. Chronologically, the book begins with the process of re-Hispanization, brought about by the involvement of Spain in northern Morocco after the 1859-1860 Spanish-Moroccan War, which included the occupation of Tetuan for a year, and continues with the Spanish Protectorate, Franco's regime, and the birth of independent modern Morocco, and ends with Spain's desire to embrace their lost Jewish brethren. Dr. Moreno has painstakingly reconstructed the ways in which this community articulated its connections to both Spanish and Moroccan homelands to narrate its past and imagine its future. The book challenges existing scholarship on Middle Eastern and North African migration in general and Jewish migration in particular in a post-colonial context, providing a good model for use in future work. The older concepts of homeland and diaspora, homeland understood as a spatial center from which its dispersed members, the diaspora, originate, and which provided, supposedly, a core identity to those dispelled, especially in MENA literature, did not help to understand, for example, the case of Hispanic Moroccan Jews. These Jews felt deeply connected not only to Morocco, but also to Spain and to other members of their diaspora in Israel, but also in other areas of the world. As other scholars have done recently, Dr. Moreno grounds the experiences of these communities within the Middle Eastern and North African societies in which they lived, avoiding a trend to refuse to see these Jewish communities as separate from the political and social context in which they lived. The study also adds to a growing literature that has challenged the Zionist paradigm, which assumed that MENA Jews either looked to Israel or assimilated into their post-colonial nations, leaving no room to see the complex and nuanced reality on the ground. Dr. Moreno's book stands out first by focusing on the transregional connections that people made, further challenging the Zionist paradigm and the literature that focuses on the Mizrahi Jews' experience of discrimination in Israel, and that assumes that this was the experience of Jews in the MENA region before their departure. Second, the volume crosses over the usual end date for the study of these groups, the creation of the State of Israel, thus challenging the distinction the existing literature makes between the Sephardi and the Northeastern and Middle Eastern and North African diasporas. The chapters in the book work together to offer distinct time periods and processes. The first two chapters sketch out the process by which Moroccan Jews were influenced by Spain, helping to shape a Hispanic identity that's centered around modern Spanish language, practices, and culture, and that was used as a way to claim a modern Jewish identity. But this process was also accompanied by a desire to document the community's origins in Spain against the backdrop of colonialism. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 introduce the creation of a Hispanic Moroccan diaspora in two different time periods, pre and post 1948. What is interesting in this section is how Dr. Moreno follows these migrants across the Atlantic, but also pays attention to the ways in which the community in Morocco was impacted and shaped as a result of that migration. He also offers an excellent analysis of how Zionism contributed to the growth of Moroccan identity and to maintaining the connections with other actual centers of this diaspora in Latin America, with Spain as a historical Jewish center. Chapter 6 follows the trajectory of Spain after Franco's regime and the government's desire to, and I quote here, restore the country's Jewish communal life and to be seen as a Western power. Hispanic Moroccan communities thus sought to connect to mythologies of Iberian ancestry, which provided them with a way to continue their identification with Spain following the end of Spanish colonialism in Morocco. And the last two chapters focus on Hispanic Moroccan Jews in Israel and in the global diaspora. In Israel, highlighting the connection to Spain, served Hispanic Moroccan Jews to avoid existing stereotypes against Mizrahi Jews in general. The realities experienced by these Hispanic Moroccan Jews in Israel, even when they not all lived in the same residential areas, spurred the creation of ethnic self-help organizations. Similar organizations were then founded in other countries of the diaspora, serving the Hispanic Moroccan Jews there. As somebody who has worked with Sephardim, including Hispanic Moroccans in Argentina in particular, I benefited tremendously from Dr. Moreno's rigorous research and astute analysis of complex and nuanced realities. His discussions of how these Jews considered themselves Spanish because of the culture they willingly adopted and spread resonated with my findings for Argentina. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Moroccan Jews who migrated to that country believed themselves European in large part because of the language they spoke and which connected them, in this case, to the country in which they were settling. The connections between Hispanic Moroccan Jews living in Argentina and those in Hispanic Morocco were indeed strong, and they helped both communities position themselves more favorably in the new societies in which they lived. The discussion of the historical trajectory of Hakatiyya is fascinating. Moving from a sign of backwardness and tradition vis-a-vis modernity to a potential symbol of identity that was shared by all those living in the diaspora. I also very much appreciated his study of the press in both Morocco and Venezuela, as well as his attention to the interest that the language and culture generated among scholars as topics that contained important information for understanding processes of identity formation and dissemination. So to conclude, so that we can start our discussion and hear from the author himself, this is an excellent study of the complex processes at play. Dr. Moreno focused on a group of people as they lived under colonialism, fascism, nationalism, both Moroccan and Jewish, and post-colonialism, moving across regions and borders and creating and maintaining a transnational diaspora. He has shied away from oversimplification and delved into the complexities which he has articulated clearly in all their nuance. He has provided us with a remarkable glimpse of what it felt like to be attached to 2 or more homes, real and imagined ones, as well as to fellow diaspora members around the globe, experiencing the realities of a tumultuous world. So those are my initial thoughts, and I'm going to now, ask the author some questions that I hope sort of highlight the most important aspects of this book, and then we will leave some time for questions from the audience. So I wanted to ask Aviad to tell us a little bit about the photograph that is on the cover of his book.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Cynthia, for this kind invitation. And thank you, Adriana, for not just moderating this event, but also for your really lovely and kind presentation of my book. I really enjoyed listening to it. And I am truly excited about this opportunity to discuss this with you and with Cynthia and the people in the room. This is a very intimate meeting, so we'll get a good feedback, I believe. So as for your question, first of all, I must say that I really love this question, the opening question, because I think it's one of those questions that really let me distill the essence of the book in a way that is also quite, if I dare say, right, funny. Because what do we see here? I took this picture from a family album, actually. It shows my grandfather, my grandmother, my infant father on the, I don't know if you can see the arrow, the pointer. They were all from Tangier in northern Morocco, and they eventually migrated from Morocco to Venezuela. Initially, as a teenager, when I grew up in Beersheba in Israel, I believe this picture was, which actually I kept seeing it in an album, I believe this picture actually captured a moment from what I believed to be the traditional lives in Morocco. This picture, with my father holding this sword in his hand. And it was only when I was beginning to work on my PhD 15 years ago that my father revealed that it actually had not been taken in Morocco, but it was taken in Spain during the trip to Latin America. Actually, the migration to Venezuela in '53. Along the way, this is what happened exactly. Along the way, they were waiting for the ship, and they decided to go and visit the Alhambra complex, and came across this souvenir shop, which offered to, like there was a touristic booth, and they could dress up as the medieval Andalusian people, and they just took the picture, put it in the album, and then 50 years later, I encountered it, and I believe this is something from Tangier representing their lifetimes. By the way, I recently, and I'm going to show some slides because I knew you were going to ask me this question. I was very surprised to discover that this booth still exists. I thank Michal Friedman for pointing this out to me and even sending me this photo about the contemporary shop. It's still, in operation. It still takes those pictures, and maybe 50 years later, there will be a grandson somewhere in the world believing this is something representative of his, grandparents. So I want to go back to my revelation, okay? This revelation that it was merely a touristic experience, at the time, it really caught me off guard because it challenged my views, long-held views, as many other Israelis held, on what we call Sephardi Mizrahi traditions in this country and their connection to Sephardi migration, Mizrahi migration. If I have a few minutes, I want to develop this point further. So until the 70s, the immigration of Jews out of Muslim majority countries, by the way, as well as I think Eastern European countries, it was viewed not merely as just a physical journey, but a cultural voyage or disengagement from the so-called old Eastern world, right? Migration was seen as emancipation, liberation in the passage to the West. And I think a very emblematic example of this is the title of André Choraki's book. I don't know if you're familiar with this person. He was advisor for David Ben-Gurion on questions of ethnicity, and so Algerian Jew. And his book title, March vers l'Occident, the march to the West, I think it really captures this notion about how migration really moves people out of the region, but also creates modernization. And this perspective, I must say, was not promoted only by the Israeli state-guided functionalist scholarship, the sociology that believed that immigrants need to, modernize. It was more prominently developed by many other national scholarships in France, in the United States, emerging after the Second World War, that developed melting pot strategies, particularly toward migrants from Muslim countries, right? We can imagine how France looks today and all those ideas about integration of immigrants that are still in place. Now, from the 70s, when the second generation of post-colonial migrants emerged in Israel, France, Canada, and many other places, newer narratives emphasized how cultures of MENA Jewish migration, MENA Jewish cultures not only survived migration, but also altered in the course of migration and even were reinvented to fit the setting, cultural and political and social settings in new land. I'm focusing on here on the Israeli case. You can see here Shlomo Deschens and Moshe Shoked book were pioneers in this approach in Israel. Later, Yoram Bilu focused on the veneration of Jewish saints as a source of continuous communal traditions after migration. Some of these studies basically showed that Sephardi and Mizrahi cultural preservations are basically reshaped as a form of nostalgia for the vanished homelands in the MENA region, in response to their marginalization by nation states, specifically by the Ashkenazi elite in Israel. I want to sum up my point here because I don't want to, continue blurping about this. The main point is that the resurgence of Sephardi Mizrahi traditions has mainly been examined in the post-colonial, post-migration context, with a strong emphasis on migration to Israel, France, and other places after 1948, or to be more specific, after the Second World War. And what I do in the book, I want to clarify another point here to explain what I do in the book. So basically, minimal attention has been given to how Sephardi and Mizrahi traditions were altered and even reinvented already in the places of origin, Morocco in this case, in the early 20th century. This is something that came up in your word, Adriana. And even more so, very minimal attention has been given to how Sephardi tradition created in the course of pre-Second World War migration to Latin America and the transnational connections they shaped between Latin America and the places of origin, how those migrations came to shape traditions in the later stage when those Jews began to leave Morocco on the eve of mass migration. So this is the twist. This is where the twist in my book comes in, because in the book, what I do is I treat Moroccan Jewish migration, I show you the map here, within a much broader historical and geographical frame of reference than the post-colonial migration to Israel and France. I'm talking about Spanish colonialism, but migration in the context of Spanish colonialism, but also in the context of post-colonialism, as you mentioned, in the context of Israeli nationalism, multiple nationalism. So I basically present a more multi-layered perspective of Moroccan Jewish cultural preservation that recognize connection to multiple homelands, among them the modern and the, let's say, imaginary trope of medieval Spain, together with the imagination of Spanish Latin America in Morocco itself, that continue to shape the memory of this community, as well as the more obvious and traditional connections to Israel, Zion, Morocco, and all kind of things that we already know and discuss in the context of Moroccan migration. So it illustrates how the community's processes of migration influence developments that eventually disseminate throughout the diaspora, going all the way to Spain in the 21st century, France in the 21st century, and even back to Morocco in the 21st century. This is what I do in the epilogue of the book. So I hope that that answers your question. I know it's a very long response.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so just moving into more particular questions about the book. Of course, we all know that the Jews in northern Morocco were linked to Spain as a result of their expulsion and settlement in northern Morocco, but the Spanish-Morocco War in 1859-1860, the arrival of Spanish citizens to Morocco, given the treaties signed then, and later the Spanish protectorate that started in 1912, all these later events significantly impacted the relationship between Hispanic Moroccan Jews and Spain. And you call this process re-Hispanization. And so I was wondering if you could explain, with a little bit more detail than, of course, I could hint at in my introductory remarks. Could you tell us a little bit about what this process of re-Hispanization looked like?
Yeah, so this is a very important background for what I'm doing. The first chapters of the book, as you mentioned, Adriana, begin by examining the influence of colonialism on the Jews who stayed put in northern Morocco, remained in northern Morocco in the early 20th century. And I think you all know here in the audience that unlike the rest of Morocco, which came under French colonialism, you see here, the Jews in the north came under official Spanish rule from 1912, 1956. Within this region, this is something I should mention, there was this northmost corner within where Tangier was located. It became an international city from late 1924 due to its strategic importance for the British, French, and other colonial powers. They couldn't basically work it out and decide who takes this region. So it was made international. They talked about Jerusalem, by the way, and as an international city, but we all know the story. So in the southern part, by the way, this is also something I want to mention, the Cabo Jubi was also Spanish protectorate, but it was sparsely populated. So the encounter there were really, how should I put it, less engaging for our discussion, right? So northern Morocco, and this is something we should all keep in mind. I'll show you some slides here. This is where the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools first struck ground, and first world branches in 1862, and then in Tétouan, and then in Tangier, 1864. They became, or not the branches themselves, but the regions, the cities in the region, Tétouan, Lahratche, Kasr el-Kebir, all those places became significant centers of European influence, particularly Tangier. You can see here, these are figures about Tangier. By 1955, this is something I located in an Arabic source, Tangier was home to about 60,000 Europeans, making up to about 40% of its population, at least according to the specific source by Al-Bazaz. A majority of them were Spaniards. This is very interesting, representing more than half of all Europeans. So why is this factor so fascinating, significant for your question, for our discussion here? So like many Jews in Morocco, the Jews of the north were expelled from Iberia. You mentioned this in the late 50th century. But unlike other Jews in North Africa, they maintained this cultural connection with Spain for centuries by speaking the Judeo-Spanish, Arabic, Tamazigh, Berber dialect called Hakitia. Okay, with its morphology and vast vocabulary that was based on Spanish, combined with all those Arabic and Hebrew words like Ladino. It was actually referred to or considered as Ladino's little sister, right? The better known Ladino. But it was part of the Ladino family, obviously. And this region presented, therefore, a very exceptional occurrence in the colonial encounters, in the history of colonialism, because it's one of the very first times, and as far as I know, the only one, where indigenous population spoke as their own native ethnic language, a very, very similar language as their colonizers, the Spaniards. And because of their linguistic similarities, as Jews increasingly, intermingled with Spaniards, along with Muslims, obviously, who also acquired Spanish, I should mention this widely, their Hakitia was rapidly vanishing. And some scholars and intellectuals already in the 20th century, they coined this term re-Hispanization. Okay, it's not me. I'm just using their trope to explain something, which is commonly used by scholars and intellectuals and leaders and all kind of writers in this community. What it meant that they get rid of the Arabic and Hebrew words, components of the Hakitia language, making it something that Benichou, Paul Benichou, the French philologist, already in 1945 described as the death of Hakitia. Hakitia, a greater part of it, he wrote, is no more than a memory with communities which continues to exist only among the older generation. This is how he wrote it. So this transition is really, is evidenced by so many things. One of the most important examples are Jewish names. Think about it. A name is a very significant identity practice. If you change your name, it means quite a lot. So Hebrew names, Arabized names like Musa, Moshe, they very quickly became Moises. All kind of, people from the communities, leaders, lower class, many people were referred to as Moises. Shlomo became Solomon, Yehuda, Leon. Also the practice of, maintaining dual surnames, the paternal and maternal, lineage. I was, my father goes by Daniel Israel Moreno de Ben Dan. So I should really, also be referred to as Aviad Moreno de Ben Dan. In Israel, it's not that popular. So, but this is something that began to evolve in northern Morocco in the early 20th century. In other words, we have so many examples. This linguistic shift was marked by a cultural shift. We have evidence of Jews attending bullfighting events in the press, in all kind of, references. For instance, in the newly built Plaza de Toros in Tangier, the Gran Teatro Cervantes, which hosted musicians like Manolo Caracol, this guy, the famous flamenco musician, or flamenco, and also the crooners of tango from Argentina, like I mentioned, what's her name, Imperio Argentina. I forgot his real name. This is the stage name. Carlos Gardel. They were popular among the Jews. I have some video recordings and audio recordings of their singing and people talking about them from the 70s. So this cultural shift did not come. It was smooth, but did not come without a challenge. A few examples that I like to go back to is that the community leaders began to express concern about how those Hispanized Jews, the Hispanized community, went as far as participating in what they believed to be Spanish practices, but there were also Christian customs, right? Like the comparsas, the parades, or attending New Year's Eve events and Noche de Reyes, all those, things popular among Northern Moroccan Jews. Of course, the modernized class. Jews also began to eat non-kosher food. This is something I discuss in the book. I actually published a co-author article with Andrew Coyne recently about this. So, and by the way, they did it because of business-oriented interactions with Spaniards. They had to go to eat tapas in the bar. And a very unexpected indication of this demand for non-kosher food appeared in the Northern Moroccan periodical called Luz, or it was an advertisement, as you can see here, for Bar Sevilla, which was established in Tetuan, and it clearly stated on its advertisement in this specific periodical that it specialized in gambas al pilpil, the Spanish-style prawn, right? The fact that the editors agreed to publish it, it means something, right? That it appealed to a Jewish audience in the region and that there was a market for it. And under these circumstances, and this is something I want to draw for a conclusion, colonialism was often portrayed by community leaders, Spanish intellectuals, as a reunion, reencuentro between the Jews and Spaniards after 400 years. And Spain was even occasionally idealized as a revived Jewish patria, a fatherland. And this Hispanization, this is something I want to end with, Hispanization of Jewish communities in Morocco was also very ambiguous. Here you can see that they kept advertising this, advertisement of the non-kosher food upside down. There is a semiotic behind it. Beyond this anecdote, right? It's just an anecdote. I think Hispanization reflected both a modern attachment to colonial Spain, but also we have to keep in mind that this is a country that rejected the right to come back to mainland Spain together with Muslims. So they formed strong attachment to Spain, but it was still very ambiguous. And I think this is very emblematic of the way they returned to Spain culturally, but also kept some kind of distance, cultural and physical distance, in a way.
Fascinating. So on the flip side of that, your second chapter focuses on how the Hispanic Moroccan Jewish community in Morocco and those already living in the Hispanic Moroccan diaspora articulated their Spanish ancestry through the early years of Spanish colonialism to what were, indeed pre-colonial traditions. So is this the context for this tradition reinvention?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an example. It was exactly in this context that some enthusiastic individuals in the community began to talk about the salvage, if not the actual revitalization of Haketia in the 20th century, when it was in a demise process, including its Arabic and Tamazight vocabulary. And one very interesting example is the work by Zarita Naon, a native of Tangier, who had graduated Columbia University in the 20s. She was a student of Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, and she returned with his advice to Tangier to collect ballad songs, romanceros, in a language that she described as a language no longer heard in the community. It's a fascinating descriptions from the late 20s. Now, an entire series of what I identify in the book as salvage ethnography emerged, expressing this academic interest in Haketia from various places. Something that happened in one place, like the development of Hispanic studies in the United States, came back to influence Morocco and vice versa. Okay, I don't have enough time to develop it, but I'll just mention very briefly a key figure in this context, José Ben Oliel, a professor of Romance philology in Lisbon in the late 19th century, one of the very first Moroccan Jews from northern Morocco to immigrate to Portugal before France, before Spain was becoming a hub. So between 1921 and 1929, after returning to Tangier from Lisbon, he became the leader, the head of the Tangier Jewish community. And in his office, he started publishing the very first academic articles about Haketia, scientific academics, articles in Spanish periodicals. And this idea of reviving the Jewish roots was developed also in several Jewish newspapers, like Adelante, Renacimiento de Israel that we see here, which was quite prominent. It was transnational, I'll explain it later. El Eco Israelita, all kind of newspapers that appeared in Spanish in the northern part of Morocco. And ironically, I think this is ironical, I don't know, maybe it's not, the Spanish colonial authority began to support this return to old Spain, right, the modern Spain. Even Franco, as I mentioned. In the midst of the Second World War, in 1940, when Jews were massacred in Europe, and we know what Franco, did during those years. Maybe it's a myth, maybe it's not, but he wasn't a big, sympathizer with the Ashkenazi Jews, let's say. That's called. Maybe Ra'anan can comment on this later. I don't want to, trap myself here. So he established the Instituto Maimonides in 1940, which was a rabbinical school emphasizing Hebrew and biblical studies in Morocco itself. That was part of his colonial regime. And this institute also issued the Sepharad, this very early Sephardic studies periodical in northern Morocco during the Second World War under Spanish colonialism. And this practice of salvage ethnography became a significant aspect of the community self-narrative, even after Morocco's independence. I don't want to elaborate more, but we see all kinds of articles even after Morocco became independent in the loose periodical, how they write about the conversos and crypto-Jews and the Maimonides and all kinds of references to the romanceros, even after Spain had left the region. So, yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay, back. You can all hear me, right? All right. So I want to start this next discussion question with two photographs from my family's photo albums. The first one is an undated photo of my great-grandfather, Fortunato Guanon, who, according to my grandmother, Lida, left the small town of Southern Corrientes and his family for a few months as he returned to Tetuan. And we can see him here hanging out with what we assume were some of his friends back in Tetuan, while his wife and all his children remained in this very small, dusty town in the Corrientes province in Argentina. And then the other postcard was sent by a niece of my grandmother's to my grandmother while she visited Casablanca in 1948. So this is the front, the photo, and then this is the back of what she wrote to my family in Buenos Aires. So these two photos illustrate one of the parts of a process that Dr. Moreno describes in detail in his third chapter titled Morocco in Latin America in Morocco. The circulation of people as they moved back and forth between these two spaces. In particular, it may be interesting to focus on how those Hispanic Moroccan Jews who returned, even if for short visits, shaped the communities they had left behind. So if you can comment a little bit on that process.
Yeah. So your reflection on this, your question, I think in your question, you are alluding to a methodological gap between the study of Moroccan international migration, Muslim migration, basically, which is often viewed as circular migration, transnational economic migration, and what we tend to learn about, read about Jewish Moroccan migration in the Jewish context, which is more typically considered as unidirectional national displacement in the post-colonial context. So, by starting my story in the book in the mid-19th century, I demonstrate how Jewish migration came to impact those who returned to Morocco, as you mentioned, as your family members, and those who also remained in the country until the mid-19th century. This is a very significant part of this chapter you mentioned. I'll just give you some examples for what I'm talking about. What I'm saying by talking about how migration influenced their places of origin. So in 1901, Isaac Pisa, who was a deputy of the Alliance Israélite Universelle French Schools, he traveled to Iquitos in Peru, and in an attempt to understand why so many Moroccan Jews who graduate those schools eventually decide to emigrate to Peru, he started, writing back to the headquarters in Morocco and then back to France. And in one of those reports, he wrote, in Tangier, they speak of Iquitos as if it is a fabulous city with streets of gold. And it is typical of a Tangerian to make his fortune in Iquitos. This is the vision of and the dream of young people. Yet, he said, you must know without doubt that the road is long and the climate is harsh. The first years for the immigrant are terrible. They have to adapt to climate, custom, and commerce. So, Pisa's word, and the way I think is taught by using them to temper the excitement about migration reflected a legend in the making among Moroccan Jews who stayed in Morocco, one in which migration was seen as a passage to paradise. This is something very typical of the Moroccan society today. This is where those two fields can merge together very easily. This is why the Moroccans in Morocco today like it so much when I talk about the specific chapter of the book. And you know this, Adriana, because we presented the book in Morocco, and they came and asked so many questions about this specific episode because they identified as part of their own history. So this legend intensified in a way in the early 20th century because migration to Latin America began to decline. And it was maintained mostly through those, additional phenomena that we can consider as transnational phenomena. For instance, return migration, particularly after the Great Depression of the 20s, when Moroccans began to create concrete monuments that increased the association of migration to South America with wealth in northern Morocco itself. This is just one example. I don't have enough time to elaborate, but I'll just mention the La Gran Bazar La Caraqueña, which was opened by a Venezuelan returnee operating on La Luneta Street, Calle La Luneta, near the Tetuan's Juderia, the modest Jewish neighborhood. And the store was, as I mentioned, owned by a Venezuelan Jew, but it also enabled those people walking in this street to see the store and get the impression that those people who came back from Venezuela are actually rich and they bring all kind of new commodities and goods. Another very interesting aspect was nostalgic stories about migration told in retrospect by returnees in Morocco itself. Such story was the story of Abraham Pinto, who had returned to Tangier from the Amazon River, and in 1945, when new waves of migration to Venezuela were starting to unfold, and by the way, it was at the age of 83, he decided that he will share his adventures with his family, and he told them to write them down. The Pinto's nephews basically published this eventually on a website. This is where I took it from. Preserving this legendary characteristic of migration to South America was also the interest of Spanish colonialism. I mean, they saw it as a direct link connecting Spain's older and newer colonies in their mind, and this was in their mind a way to develop a narrative about the Jew as a mediator in their newer colonial projects in Africa. And the General Franco Instituto, the Institute for Hispanic Arab Studies, published Indianos Tetuaníes. You all know, it was, by the way, part of our trilogy, El Indiano Alcade y la Luna, authored by Isaac Benaroche Pinto, the son of a returnee from Venezuela. And you all know that Indiano in Spanish actually refers to those who found wealth, fortune in Latin America. So in this novel, it recounts the story of this young man, probably himself, who found wealth in Latin America and came back to alleviate the life chance of his family, the economic burdens of his parents in Venezuela. And the novel ends with a story about a big wedding that he could donate and cover with his own, money, which he made in Argentina. And the story, by the way, stimulated the curiosity of Moroccan Jews also in Latin America. This is a report about this novel in Venezuela. I'll give a few more examples, and I'll try to be brief. So return migration also created a notion in the community in Morocco that some Moroccan Jews were actually South American Jews. They had South American citizenship. So on the occasion of Peru's Independence Day, Declaration Day, June 21st, they basically, announced a greeting to all the Peruvians in Morocco. And we can just assume that they were referring to Jews, right? Not just Peruvians of Catholic background. Some families were nicknamed based on their success in Latin America, like the Toledano family. I remember when I talked to some of the interviewees I interviewed in the beginning of my PhD, they told me, well, but your grandfather was a Venezuelan, actually. He wasn't Moroccan. He lived quite, a portion of his life in Morocco, but he was born in Venezuela, so he was a Venezuelan. By the way, we also see many references to those people who were sojourned, right? They moved back and forth between Latin America and Morocco in the newspaper, like Renacimiento that I mentioned earlier. More than anything, We see how the associations of migration to South America with wealth was also fueled by remittances, also a very common practice in international migration. The Achnasat Orchim, the Welcoming Guest Society, was a communal institute that established the lodging services for visiting communal figures in 1911, with relying on contributions from overseas, with contributions from Caracas, from the Moroccan community in Caracas, being very significant. They established a hostel, a synagogue, many other facilities. Also, Jews from Argentina, Adriana, I think you mentioned this in your book, they donated to the establishment of the Ben Shimol Hospital in Tangier. It's important to mention that the influx of donation from abroad did not stop even during hard times, such as the First World War and even later. So we see something very interesting. Also reports about how those compatriots in Buenos Aires are being very generous, even more than toward their beloved son. It's something that is beyond the biological connection. They remember the community. They develop communal connection to Morocco, even after a generation or so after they left Morocco. And you can see this reference here from Renacimiento again. This newspaper also frequently reported about, as I mentioned, all kind of traveling people. So it's a very interesting articulation of all kind of multi-directional links and movements that we're not very used to talk and discuss and read about when we address Moroccan Jewish migration.
Yes, thank you. I always remember, and maybe we can touch on this later, but my family being invited to the birthday of the king events later on after, of course, the independence of Morocco. And, this calling, to these Jewish families, there's no other Moroccans here in Argentina, but the fact that the king and the embassy reached out to them. I remember my great aunt just so proud that they have been invited to, to celebrate this in the embassy, and their connection then to Morocco was reignited, after these, strategies. The other thing that I thought we could spend a little time on, and that means you, going into the particulars of the examples that you provide, is that, you also reminds us that Zionism is usually wrongly assumed to only have been central to fueling Jewish nationalism, right? Understood as a desire to move to Israel. The question here is, could you remind us, right, the role that you see Zionism played in the Hispanic Moroccan diaspora, not necessarily, right, connected to this idea of moving to Israel?
I'll try to be brief because I think we are running out of time. We want to, enable questions from the audience. I want to enable them. Looking forward to hearing the people's perspective. So I'll be brief. Zionism emerged against the backdrop, this is what I maintain in the book, the backdrop of both global migration to Latin America and also Spain, by the way, and also the so-called re-Hispanization process, including the revival of pre-1949 Iberian identities. The first Spanish and Portuguese language newspapers that had Zionist content developed outside of Morocco, actually, even before Zionism was very developed in Morocco itself. Again, I see Ra'anan. Ra'anan wrote a very interesting article about Israel in Argentina, one of the very first Moroccan newspapers, Moroccan-led newspaper that basically Moroccan expats newspaper that exposed this idea in Argentina. Also the newspaper A Columna in Brazil, that was founded before the Balfour Declaration. This is very interesting, with a combination or collaboration between a Moroccan Jew and Catholic sympathizers of Zionism. This is a very interesting development. These developments in Latin America then came back to shape Zionist activities in Morocco with advocates such as S. de Levi, who went to studies in the, the colonies in Argentina, who was basically an emissary of the Alianza Israelita Universal, but he came back, and then after acquiring knowledge about Zionism in Latin America, he founded the very first nationwide Zionist organization in Morocco in the 20s. And he did not bring them back to Tangier, but to Casablanca. This is where he moved to after returning to Morocco. So we see this trajectory of Zionist, resurgence or Zionist references awakening, happening in a network of people that basically utilized the evolving Spanish or Hispanic diaspora that I'm talking about over time. And moreover, this is also very interesting, among those who worked to advance the attachment of Jews to Spain, there were some people who worked simultaneously to promote Zionist awareness. A very interesting example is Leon Khalfon, Rabbi Leon Khalfon, who was the founders of the very first Zionist cells in Tetuan in the year 1900. And he eventually also corresponded with Manuel Ortega, who was a very well-known Hispanist who wrote a book about Moroccan Jews. And he talks about Zionism and returning to Spain culturally in the same enthusiastic manner, I can say. And it's very interesting. And I want to pinpoint something here. This duality that we're talking about, it was possible, as you mentioned, because it was a very different kind of Zionism than the type we usually associate Moroccan Jews with, specifically after 1948, because it was not oriented toward unidirectional migration to Palestine, but it was a movement of cultural revival that was part of the worldwide dispersal. So this is one of the reasons why we can see in this specific community that even after 1948, due to the significant century-old global migration at the time, Zionism among the Jews of the North was demonstrated basically the ability to coexist with other national and ethnic identities, as we see here. They could publish one issue on Tu B'Shvat in the kibbutz, and the other one, about how they feel really connected to the palace now, to the Moroccan Sultan, right after Moroccan independence. And by the way, I should mention that migration to Israel from this specific region was quite minimal. It was nothing like the migration from Casablanca, from Marrakesh. We're talking about 70% from Tangier and Tetuan, about 7% during Operation Yachin, the very big migration operation led by the Israeli state, by Israel in 1961. Just 70% joined. It did not mean that they did not leave Morocco. They left Morocco, but they had multiple options and choices and branches and networks that eventually made them reunite with the Zionist idea elsewhere, but not in Israel, mostly in the Hispanic diaspora.
Do you want us to jump to questions, or do you think that there's more time for one more specific question to you?
How are we doing with the time? I mean, you're the organizer.
We are fine. If you
do you want to take another question? Yeah, why not?
Okay, so then I'll just ask this last question before hearing from the audience today. So in chapter 6, you focus on how Spain became a new hub for Hispanic Moroccan Jews in the context of Spain's new role in the Jewish Sephardi diaspora. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit here about the role of Hispanic Moroccan Jews in the return of Jewish presence in Spain, or on how Spain helped promote Venezuelan Jewish integration to that country.
Yeah, so first of all, as you pointed out, the notion of communities' ancestry in Spain, which had initially developed during the colonial period, under colonial rule, the colonial context, it began to travel to multiple places, multiple national cultural, social settings in Spain, as you mentioned, but also in Venezuela, in Israel, in France later on, and even, as I mentioned, came back to Morocco. Now in Spain, in the late 60s and early 70s, but most particularly in the post-Francoist state, which worked very hard to rebrand itself as a democratic state and historically tolerant toward Jews and Muslims. That was quite different than what was happening under Spanish colonialism. I can elaborate on this later on if you want. The emerging Jewish leadership in Spain eventually began to capitalize. By the way, many of them came from northern Morocco. They began to capitalize on this narrative to smooth their integration into the Spanish national discourse on this convivencia, you know, the golden age of coexistence in Spain, in Iberia. Now, you have to keep in mind that this is very interesting because it's particularly complex when you think about it in terms of nostalgia, immigrant nostalgia. Nostalgia typically develops from a distance, when a geographical distance, when immigrants yearn for the place where they left. In this case, they develop a very typical nostalgia for Morocco. We see it in the book in many chapters. But here what we see is something different. There is another layer of complexity because immigration to Spain, distancing from Morocco, reinforced narrative of nostalgia or narratives of nostalgia for Spain after returning to Spain. And to add another layer of complexity, this trend did not stay in Spain, but continued to travel across the new diaspora to Venezuela, for instance. I want to use the Venezuelan example because I don't have enough time. I can talk about Israel if you want, but let's take the Venezuelan one. So the reimagining of the Jewish past in Spain, as it was disseminated in Spain itself in the 80s, it began to shape Sephardi identities in Venezuela. I found really numerous articles about the romanceros in the Spanish Golden Age, the Haketia language in publications from this specific community, often stemming from this transcultural or transnational cultural exchange between various individuals working in Spain and in Venezuela itself in the 80s. A very prominent example that I can recall is Rabbi Baruch Benito Garzon, who now lives in Israel, and his brother Moises Garzon. Moises was editor of Magen Escudo. Unfortunately, this is probably one of the last issues of this. I mean, it's about to end its activity, unfortunately, due to lack of finance. This is something I just found about very recently. But it was running for a very long period in Venezuela, starting from 1970. And this activity began with a collaboration between two siblings, Rabbi Baruch Benito Garzon and Moises Garzon, the president, prominent Sephardi leader and the president of what would later become the Centro Estudios Sephardi de Caracas in Venezuela. Now, you asked me about the integration of Moroccan Jews in Venezuela, if I remember correctly. I mean, how this affected basically the Venezuelan context. So I must explain something. I mean, I'm sure most people here know this, but Moroccan Jews constituted a very prominent segment of the Sephardi community in Venezuela. They really led the community, the Sephardi community altogether. And they began to strategically emphasize a Sephardi identity and connection to both pre-1492 and modern Spain to foster their integration in Venezuela, in the Venezuelan elite society. Leaders like Abraham Butbul Hachuel really proactively emphasized this contribution of Sephardim both to Venezuela's economic and cultural development, and it was drawing on parallels between the historical significance of Sephardim while in Spain and the impact of Sephardim in the newer world. It's a very interesting narrative. Now, this approach was particularly effective in Venezuela because it resonated with Venezuela's national ethos of the mestizaje, the café con leche, depending on how you look at it. So, and you all know what I mean, right? It's like a blending of diverse cultural heritage. Now, I can give you an example from this very interesting novel by Isaac Shukron, the Venezuelan novelist. In this novel, he dedicates a chapter to Haketia, written in Hakiatized Spanish. It's like it tries to place with the word so that it will read like Haketia, but it's not really Haketia because it did not really know Haketia. And the main attempt was to mediate this dialect to the non-Jewish Venezuelan reader. One of the very fascinating stories in this is that Daniel Benabal, the protagonist, was an economist in Venezuela's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, decides to go back to Morocco, going back to the second question or third question you asked me. And he did so because he lost his father in an earthquake in Venezuela, and also his wife. And in the novel, he writes how the protagonist reached out to a friend in New York, telling me about this, and then he gets a response that it doesn't make sense to him. So he writes back, "You think this is funny that a Jew like me would want to go and live with the Moors in Morocco? You forget that I am a Sephardi Jew from Venezuela." This is what he tells him in the letter, part of the book. "I'm so African, I'm so Spanish, I'm so Venezuelan that the Yiddish speaker in Brooklyn would consider me to be a heretic, someone who is completely out of the Jewish family." So it's in a way an attempt to rebrand the Jewish Moroccan Sephardi background in a way that would smoothly fit into the broader Venezuelan narrative about the mestizaje. I can go on and on if you want, but I think it's enough.
Well, it might actually be good, Cynthia. I don't know, what do you think? Just to give a chance for the audience to ask their questions.
Yes, let's open for questions. Ranan.
Hi, thank you so much, both you, Aviad, and Adriana. I have not read the book yet, but I've read several articles that you've published, Aviad, and they are all fascinating and, rich with insights about different issues relating to diaspora and diaspora homeland ties. I have two questions. One is very specific, and the other one tries to zoom out a little bit. The first one has to do with the involvement of Jews of Spanish Morocco in Moroccan nationalism. I mean, you mentioned their identification with the Jewish national movement, Zionism, and I wonder about their involvement in the Moroccan national movement. I think that I told you once about an anecdote relating to the assassination of a Jewish Moroccan in Tetouan, which was supposedly an anti-Semitic event, while in fact it had to do with internal fights or quarrels within the Moroccan nationalist movement. The other one is to try to understand the particularity or uniqueness of your case. I mean, what's relevant from your discussion to the Jewish Moroccans of French Morocco, for example, as far as various narratives of identification, the tension between ethnicity and a more cosmopolitan view, the power of community beyond the homeland and the host society, etc. So I'd like to hear your comments on these two questions.
So to answer briefly your first question, I write about this in the book. There was this movement called El Wifaq, which was a group of enthusiastic individuals, Muslims and Jews, working together to create a new Jewish society that can integrate into the new Moroccan state. Now, it was very developed in northern Morocco. There were branches in northern Morocco. Actually, the picture I showed you from the Luz periodical is a picture from the visit of the prince in crown, the future king Hassan II, who visited the Jewish club in northern Morocco. Now the narrative here is fascinating because what they say is we do not need to get rid of our Sephardi identity to integrate into the Moroccan state, because Morocco itself has an Andalusian background. So by reconnecting to Morocco, we actually reconnect to our Moroccan, Andalusian origins. We bring this older, aspect of Moroccan cultures and proto-nationalism back into the conversation. And this is, by the way, something that still appeals to many Moroccans in contemporary Morocco. They see this specific story I tell each and every time I come back to Morocco and talk about it and deal with activity related to it. They really search for this specific origin, which they identify as their own origin, regardless of the Jewish story. So I think this is a very significant aspect of their integration, or the attempt to integrate, I should say, because most of them eventually left. What's unique about the Northern Moroccan case? So first of all, I think the book is one of the first to study migration in the Spanish post-colonial context. And there is a very significant connection between the colonial and post-colonial context here, because migration had begun in the 19th century because Jews spoke Spanish. You can see all kinds of references to this in Angel Pulido's book, how he said the Alianza Israelita Universal should actually teach Jews Spanish because it would make more sense. It would promote their migration. There are 80 million people speaking Spanish in the world, whereas just like, I don't know, I can't remember the number, 40 million French speakers. So it would make more sense to attach this specific cultural trait to this specific community, even within the context or within the operation of the Francophone Jewish schools, Alliance Universal. Now, this is just one aspect, but another very interesting aspect is their migration to Latin America, which, as you know, comprise mostly of Jews. Adriana mentioned this very interesting treatment by the Moroccan embassy of the Jewish society, because they just identify the Jewish communities in Latin America as their own diaspora, regardless of their faith. Now, in Venezuela, we tend to think about Aliyah as I think Sergio de la Pergola would connect to this. We tend to think about Aliyah as a sui generis, as a unique phenomena, whereas it is really, it has its own, universal aspects. Now, when you look at this specific story I'm telling, the story of immigration to Venezuela, of course, it's very universal. It's a very global story, but it's also a very unique particular case, even within the broader story of Moroccan Jewish migration to Israel. It's a migration to a country that attracts only Jews based on the Sephardi trust network. Muslims are excluded, not by law, not legally. They're excluded because they're not part of this specific, ethnic network. And it creates a community that is really, as you know, very particular in the way it treats its Hispanic background, as I just mentioned. This is something that is unique within the Jewish case and within the broader Moroccan story. So it's something that you would not find in, if you look at any kind of migration from the French protectorate or other regions of Morocco, or the broader MENA region for that reason, for that matter, also. Yeah. I think that's enough.
Thank you, Aviad.
Yeah.
Yes, Sergio?
Thank you. Congratulations, Aviad. I have to read the book, of course. I have two questions. One is more specific and one is more generic. As you know, I did some work in Venezuela around the year 2000. I did a survey. Unfortunately, because of what happened in Venezuela, the detailed results were never published, but there is a lot of significant information. And of course, we found a significant group of former Spanish Morocco Jews very well placed in Caracas, and the impression was a very strong and well-rooted community, well organized, and very, very meaningful, very good institutions, very impressive. As we know, that community has not completely, but in large part, disappeared. Many have left.
Yeah.
And so my question is whether you you follow the further migration of Moroccan Jews, Spanish Morocco, from Venezuela elsewhere.
Venezuela,
I
yeah.
suppose some went to Spain, some went to the US,
Yeah.
but you certainly must have a sense, a more specific sense of the continuing trend of dispersion and concentration in new places. This is the specific question. The generic question is this: as an expert, I want to pick up your mind about the use of the term Mizrahi. I am totally alien to the use of Mizrahi, and I find it's a sort of an aberration. But thinking of Tangiers, the westernmost point in the old world, to call that Mizrahi is absolutely inappropriate. And so, I mean, we understand discourse and the politicization of discourse and the subtleties of discourse, but I want to ask your personal opinion about this. Do you use it? How you use it? Why you use it or don't?
Yeah. So let's start with the first question because it's easier to approach, right? Yeah, I mean, you know, Venezuelan, Moroccan Jews experienced a second exodus, as you know, not less significant. But it did, and by the way, as in the Moroccan case, it was parallel with broader migrations happening from the same place, and sometimes to the same, you know, destinations. In Morocco, they, you know, left Morocco together with Muslims, both Amazirs and Arabs, to France, sometimes to the same villages. This is a very interesting model that you might be very interested in. There is specific research on this. Now in Venezuela, you also see communities, sometimes neighborhoods, moving to specific places in the, let's say, Miami-Dade region, right? In Aventura, for instance. I'm sure you're familiar with this new setting, this new hub of Venezuelans. Now, it's very interesting because in Miami, first and foremost, they have to deal with their Latino identity, not just as Jews, but as Latinos, like generally. And sometimes they find it easier to mingle or intermingle with Venezuelans of Catholic faith. Sometimes they can, you know, intermingle with Jews from other Latin American backgrounds. But my point is that the Sephardi and Moroccan identities are really minimized in this context. So it's interesting to follow this specific phenomena. It just reemerges in a very context-dependent events, synagogues, all kind of, you know, family reunification and all kind of, you know, religious-related events. Sometimes, by the way, you see a Moroccan Venezuelan goes to a Moroccan synagogue, but is completely disoriented because he doesn't understand the language. And that would eventually, you know, lead him to go to another, you know, Latin American synagogue. I saw it, you know, in my own eyes when I visited Miami a few years ago. Now in Israel, that's another hub. There is a significant community communicating through WhatsApp. My father is one of the members of Venezuelans living in the strip between Ra'anana and Tel Aviv, basically. And they're reuniting once in a while. Some of them are, you know, school friends. They you know, reunite based on this common background. But they also tend to talk a lot about Venezuela and what's going on in Venezuela, and you know what's going to be in Venezuela. And some people start talking about living Israel, so they talk about the new diaspora in Latin America as an option. Sorry, in Miami as an option. So it really, you know, in a way, get really entwined with the situation in Israel in a very, let's say, multi-layered way. The layers here are really branching out in a very speedy and unexpected way. connecting all kinds of migrations. Again, speedy way, meaning sometimes people can come to Israel and after a year decide to go, but they're going to a place that has evolved already because other people from Venezuela decide to go to it. One of the examples is Spain. Now, Spain is another very interesting example because paradoxically, the immigration led to the reaffirmation of Sephardic roots, not just because there was a specific interest in the Sephardic background, ancestry in the new places, but because it actually led to an option to apply for Spanish citizenship after 1915. There was a competition between the Israeli law of return and the new law, and people began to consider this after 1915, even after they had immigrated to Israel. So that's another layer of complexity. And this is where Spain comes back in and, shows its relevance again in the 21st century as a country with, solid meaning for the Spanish Moroccan community. Many of the Spanish Moroccan leaders began to, immerse themselves in all kinds of activities oriented toward the, applications of Spanish, Moroccan Jews and even other Jews of Spanish background toward this specific project of Spanish citizenship. So it's very interesting to see how this community is still involved in this. About the Mizrahi trope. So, well, as a historian, I cannot be too, let's say, struck by the fact that Mizrahim is a very strong trope used in Israel. But at the same time, as a historian, I can tell you that it's anachronistic to look at it as a very meaningful term. It begins to become a meaningful term as part of a boundary work between the Spanish Moroccan community and what they encounter in Israel as a marker of the Moroccan community as a collective. For instance, when Moroccan Jews in Israel began to identify Mizrahim from the 80s and 90s on, the Spanish Moroccan Jews in Israel say this is not part of our legacy. We're not appreciating this even. We need to do something to counter this idea that all Moroccans belong to this Mizrahi trope. Because we're not, we're Sephardim. Our language is Haketia. So it does have this Arabic components. We're not acting, white in the Israeli context. We have our background, but it's not the Mizrahi trope. Now, it's a very particular history, but of course, this is just a case in point for something much bigger, for all kinds of communities that cannot identify with the Mizrahi trope. And, it's a traveling concept because today you'll see more and more communities go by the specific, category Mizrahim, but also Sephardim. Sephardi is also a traveling concept in a way. I mean, you can see Sephardim in Australia with backgrounds in India and Egypt and Iraq identify as Sephardim for purposes of organization, umbrella organization. Adriana, by the way, wrote in her book about Argentinian Sephardi Jews, how the Sephardi term became an umbrella term, reuniting Jews from all kind of, Sephardi background as a way of basically practical, strategic way to reunite and create efficient organizations vis-a-vis the Yiddish-speaking, German-speaking organizations in Latin America. So it's still in, this is something that you will still find in many Sephardi communities, and this is the way I'm approaching it, through the material and the narratives that are coming out of the community, not just, out of the Israeli mainstream narrative, if I can put it that way.
Thank you. We can hear Florinda's comment.
Yeah.
Florinda, you have to open your mic.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a personal remark, but also something beyond. I am really very, very moved to see on the screen my very dear and very much longed for friend Isaac Chokron. And I was thinking about him since this meeting started, and I think, I don't know if it's been done, but I just suggest he would be a fine case study for Moroccans, Jewish Moroccans in Venezuela, because, for instance, his father, to ensure that he gets a good integration in the country, sent him to a military school, which is not usually the place for a Jewish boy from anywhere. And he spent his whole life trying to combine, to join positively his Venezuelan identity, his Moroccan identity, and his Jewish identity. So I think he's a very special representative of all the processes that went on there. By the way, if I have time for a funny anecdote, as you can see him on the screen, he looked very much like the Moroccan king. And it happened to him in all the world, also in Israel. He always looked for Moroccan restaurants to go to eat.
About it.
That the personnel got very nervous because they thought it was something of the royal house of Morocco was in the place. So he always enjoyed very much this confusion. As I said, just a personal remark, but I think it's a case which is worth studying and going into his biography as a sample of possibilities.
Now I think I made a mistake.
Much.
Thank you, Florina. Now I think I made a mistake that is not on the book cover instead of my family's photo, because now what appeal to a broader audience probably.
Sure, it would.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful remark. Thank you.
Do we have other questions or comments?
Yeah, can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
From Yitzchak Kerem. Aviad, you wrote an impressive book. I want to know what you think about this analysis. Basically, we're not talking about a hybridity, we're talking about a tribridity. Okay, so you have a rooted Jewish community from Spanish Morocco. You have an Iberian identity, which it was very problematic because Spain was mostly off limits. Iberia was off limits. Okay, but the French influence made the Jew much more cosmopolitan and Western educated. Okay, but in your analysis, you're forgetting the old Yeshuv type Zionism of moving to Eretz Israel. The main crux of the old Yeshuv in the 1840s, 50s, 60s were North African Jews, including Algerian Jews, Northern Moroccan Jews, et cetera, et cetera. There were deep roots between many Moroccan communities in Sfat and Tiberia. But so you have Venezuela, which is like a country which was open, and essentially you had these pioneers. You had the Ben Zakkain rabbis. You had these two unusual cultural icons, Sarfati and Garciente, and a metropole was created in Venezuela. It wasn't just in Caracas, all throughout Venezuela. You have very many impressive centers, small enclaves of northern Moroccan Sephardic Jews. But the main drive was Eretz Israel, and that's what happened in the 50s. The Jews, the Olim in the 50s and 60s, they're stigmatized, and they went to places like Kiryat Shmona. They weren't speaking Jews.
You're off.
And they were very modest. And so, but most went to the east as opposed to the west. But those that went to the west created a very impressive metropole. So, but Spain was off limits. Only only after
Well,
Francoism could
officially,
Jews and Tangier Jews settle really in Madrid and Spain. So it's sort of it's not really the narrative. It's very abstract. The whole connection to Iberia. It's a strong Sephardic identity, but out of
yeah,
Iberia. Okay.
Okay, I'll respond. So first of all, you're absolutely right that Spain was officially legally off limits because of the fact that the law of expulsion, the decree, Alhambra decree, was still in place. But we have evidence, very solid evidence, of Jews returning to the Iberian Peninsula already in the 19th century. You can even read about it in the Hebrew press, about all kind of people walking around dressed like Moroccans in Algeciras and in all kind of villages in southern Spain. And the connections where you can read actually, I haven't covered this era, but you can read Isaac Gershon's work on the connections between the communities in Tetuan.
No, I know all this. I've researched it,
okay.
but that's not the dominant narrative.
Of course. So this is one aspect that I can refer to. Another aspect is, I mean, you're right that I'm not covering the 19th century waves of migration. I see Michal Ben Yaakov here. She's an expert on this, so she can probably comment on the very interesting centers of the Tetuan community in Haifa, the Bibas family, for instance. We know another very interesting example. There was this Shadar, emissary from Eretz Israel, called Mesud Davila. I forgot who wrote about him. Maybe Michal, you'll help me. What is his name? Moshe Ovadia.
They're Algerian.
No. Mesud Davila was an emissary who was sent by the Vada Eda Ma'aravit, the community of the Ma'aravim, the Maghrebi Jews in Jerusalem, the council that was established in 1860, to collect funds, to raise funds from all those communities I mentioned. He has this, shtar, this, basically like the note he was traveling with to go and collect the funds from people in Iquitos and people in all kinds of Brazilian cities throughout the Amazon basin, people in Argentina, people in Venezuela. He mentioned all those places. And it's really interesting to see how those communities eventually did donate the Yeshuv in Eretz Israel. Meaning that even before the more, let's say, modern organization of Zionism after the first Zionist Congress, I'm talking about the mid-19th century, when other concepts of Jewish migration were in place, we still see this old connection, long-lasting connection, Jewish connection, ethno-national connection, or proto-ethno-national connection between the new communities in Latin America and the Yeshuv. Obviously, this connection will change over the course of the years, but it's still a very similar connection. People in Venezuela still donate, or there used to be time, not today, unfortunately, or people in Argentina, as Adriana knows very well, looked at Israel and specifically the Sephardi Moroccan communities in Israel as people who can, they're in need of charity and their own solidarity. All those networks of solidarity are really evolving, and you can see it very well in the book. The thing is that I'm not covering the 19th century. Okay, the story begins in the 19th century, but the analysis begins in the 20th century. This is the reason why I'm not addressing this specific aspect that you're alluding to. And by the way, another point you made, I must, explain that those people from the north that did not shy away from their French identities. They continued to speak French. They knew French. It was part of their identity, but they intertwined it with their Spanish identity. That's the point.
Thank you, Aviad. We will, before we close, we will give Michal Ben Yaakov the word.
Just a short comment on those two things. Yes, there was a strong there was a strong connection between northern Morocco, Tetuan, Tangier, and Eretz Israel in the 19th century. And their presence was noted mainly most of them went to Haifa, but we're talking about very small numbers. We're talking about tens of people. So you have to make the distinction between the connection, which explains why so many Shadarim were going there because it was worth their while, and those that actually made Aliyah prior to the First World War.
Yeah.
And congratulations, Aviad.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you. Good to see you here. Thank you.
Thank you,
תודה
Michael.
רבה.
So, unless Aviad, you want to say anything else, I just will close with a small information that that I told you before, that I am working on Jewish-Spanish literature of the 21st century, and so less than 2 years ago, almost I would say for the first time, Haketia translation appeared. It was made by Alicia Siso, and she translated The Little Prince. And it's an amazing opportunity to put Haketia into writing, because normally Haketia is an oral language. So this is in the framework of, if you want, the revival of or the resistance of minorized literatures and languages. And so I think it's a good news, and I hope we will find more of them. Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Adriana and all the public. I wish you a new and very peaceful 2025, and see you on January 20th and other opportunities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.